My earliest memories were on the steamer coming from India to Britain when I was age 5, must have been 1920. And I can vaguely remember my mother telling me not to climb on the various pieces of equipment on the deck. It was the tradition in those days that if you had a solar topi, you know what that is, a solar helmet, when you left India, you attached a cord to it and you trailed it in the wake of the ship. So I can vaguely remember doing that. Well, I was in India because I was born there, and I wasn't given any option about that. I was born there because that's where my mother was. My mother was there because my father was there, and my father was an officer in the Indian Army. He was commissioned in what was then known as the Queen's Own Madras Sappers and Miners, and we still have his commission signed by Queen Victoria with her own hand. And he did the things that engineers do. Amongst other things, he built a bridge somewhere, I think in Bangalore. And he really wasn't a religious man, but something came over him, and when he'd finished the bridge, he had carved in it a verse from Genesis. He looked on all his works and saw that it was good. So, but as I say, he was not a religious man. He was a good man, but not a religious man. But my parents really were very good to me. Because my father was still serving in the army in India, of course he spent most of his time there. And my mother was with him most of the time, not all the time. So I spent most of my early years with my grandparents. That's my mother's parents. And like everybody else in the family, my grandfather was a soldier, served in World War I, and was Director General of Transport and Supplies in India in World War I. My whole family background really is in India. He was a good man, I would say a godly man. In those days, people didn't talk about religion. It was a personal business. But I came to realize later that both my grandfather and my grandmother were, in their own ways, sincere believers. In fact, and I remember sometimes I would burst into my grandmother's bedroom at about 7 o'clock in the evening, and she was always on her knees praying. I'm sure she was praying for her grandson, who had all sorts of potential problems. In fact, I really have to say, I think one of the great influences in my life was my grandmother's prayers. I had then what was called a governess, which was a woman who came in and kind of did what my parents should have been doing. I had a succession of governesses, and then at age 9, I was sent off to a preparatory school, what they call a prep school. And there's quite a well-known photograph in the family of me about to go to prep school, suitably attired in a tweed suit with a waistcoat, a vest, and a bowler hat at the age of 9. God has equipped me academically. I was always top of the class. I was very keen on games, football, cricket especially. At the age of 13, I was entered for a scholarship examination for Eton, and I was successful. So at the age of 13, I entered Eton as a scholar, and there were about 1,100 pupils in those days, but there were 70 scholars. The number 70 was maintained exactly because every year they took in 14 scholars, the top 14 in the examination. Eton was in many ways a strange place. I mean, there were a lot of rules. For the first year, you were not permitted to put your hands in your pockets. And until you reached a certain stage, you were only allowed to walk on one side of the street. And you always wore, well, when you were tall enough, you wore a tailcoat for everything except sports. And I remember going to W.A. Stimson, who was my tailor, and being measured for my tailcoat. And you know, I paid the tremendous sum of £7 for a completely tailored suit, including the waistcoat. Eton was a very strange place. I mean, it was extremely snobbish, but so snobbish that you didn't have to appear snobbish, if you can understand what I mean. You just took it for granted. The educational was, in its own way, tremendous. I mean, there was a proportion of one teacher to every 12 students. I remember before I was, let's say at the age of 14, I was expected to be able to write verse in Latin and Greek and translate English poetry into Latin and Greek. You might say, well, what was the use of it? Very little in a way, but it was a tremendous discipline. I mean, I was really trained to think and to work systematically, to get my homework done in time. And I view younger generations today, and I see how little real discipline there is in their lives. And discipline is something that really is worth having. I mean, it can be turned in many different directions, but an undisciplined life is really a chaotic life. There's a lack of real focus and purpose. I have a real burden for the young people who are growing up in Britain today or throughout the world, because there is so little of real discipline in their lives. And in fact, that many people today resent discipline. But it's a mistake. I mean, it can be wrongly enforced, it can be unwisely applied, but it's a key to success in life. I don't care today about the fact that I know Latin. I never bother with Latin. I do use Greek because I read the New Testament in Greek. But what I got beyond that was discipline of study.